I've been a cop for almost 8 years, and I always thought night shifts were the quietest. It was early fall, and the night was cold, wrapped in this thick fog that seemed to swallow everything around me. My shift had been uneventful until I got a call over the radio. A man said his car had broken down on a rural road. I'd dealt with situations like this plenty of times, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the spot, expecting just another routine call. When I got there, the guy was standing next to a black sedan with the hood popped open. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a heavy jacket and a worn-out cap. His face was mostly hidden in the shadows, but something about his eyes made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on it. He explained that his car had just stopped working and the battery wouldn't respond. While I was shining my flashlight on the engine, I noticed something. Fresh tire tracks leading off the main road toward an old, run-down garage that was almost invisible in the dark. The garage was about 50 yards away, partially hidden by trees, and it had this eerie, abandoned vibe. I asked the guy if he knew anything about the place, but he just shook his head and avoided eye contact. As I kept checking his car, I couldn't shake the feeling about those tire tracks. It didn't make sense. The road was barely used, and there was no good reason for anyone to head into that garage. I decided to check it out and told the man I'd be back in a minute. He just stood there and mumbled, "Go ahead," but it sounded more like a dare than permission. As I walked toward the garage, flashlight in hand, the silence of the night felt heavier with each step. When I got closer, I saw that the garage door was slightly open, creaking faintly in the breeze. The smell hit me first, a nasty mix of old oil, rusted metal, and something sour that churned my stomach. My gut was screaming that something was off, but I pressed on. The beam of my flashlight swept through the space, and my chest tightened. Tools were scattered everywhere, clearly used for stripping vehicles. Further inside, I saw clothes tossed on the floor, stained with something dark. Even in the dim light, I knew it was blood. My mind was racing. The scene didn't make any sense, and this overwhelming feeling of being watched crept over me. I kept sweeping my flashlight around, trying to piece it all together. Near the pile of bloody clothes, I noticed drag marks on the floor, like something heavy had been pulled across it. It was clear there had been a struggle. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but before I could say a word, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart dropped. When I turned around, the man from the car was standing in the doorway, holding a tire iron. The grin on his face was the stuff of nightmares. "You shouldn't have stuck your nose where it doesn't belong," he said, his tone chillingly calm. He spun the tire iron in his hand like he was weighing his options. I tried to keep my composure and talk him down, but he started walking toward me, forcing me to back up further into the garage. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I calculated my next move. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me, swinging the tire iron toward my head. I barely dodged, but the impact landed on a shelf beside me, sending tools crashing to the ground. That was my wake-up call. Instinct took over. I aimed my flashlight beam straight into his eyes, momentarily blinding him. It gave me just enough time to grab my baton. The fight that followed was loud and chaotic, with metal clanging and our footsteps echoing in the confined space. He was stronger than he looked, and every block I managed to make drained more of my energy. I finally landed a hit on his arm, and he dropped the tire iron with a loud clatter. He cursed and staggered back, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't done yet. I used the few seconds I had to grab my radio and call for backup, keeping my eyes locked on him. I gave them my location and requested immediate assistance. He realized what I was doing and charged at me again, but this time I was ready. I swung my baton hard at his leg, and he went down with a scream of pain. Wasting no time, I pinned him to the ground and slapped on the handcuffs. He thrashed and fought like a wild animal, but I managed to keep him subdued. When I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. As I waited for backup to arrive, I took a quick look around the garage to see what else was there. What I found only made things worse. There were crates filled with stolen license plates and scattered documents, all pointing to some kind of larger operation. But what really shook me was a small pile of personal items: wallets, phones, and even a blood-stained gold necklace. This wasn't just about stealing cars. These were trophies, evidence of something far darker. My stomach turned, but I stayed focused. When my team arrived, I briefed them and handed the guy over. He'd gone eerily quiet, his blank stare somehow even more unsettling than his earlier threats. The investigation that followed uncovered a massive criminal network. The man was part of a group that didn't just steal cars but targeted drivers, often ending in violence. The bloody clothes in the garage? They belonged to someone who'd been reported missing weeks earlier. I'll never forget his expression as I walked away that night. A mix of hatred and apathy, like he didn't care what would happen next. Since then, I've learned to always trust my gut. What started as a routine call nearly cost me my life, and I'll never look at a quiet night shift the same way again. I've always been proud of my job as a school resource officer in our small town. It was a pretty peaceful routine, and I knew almost everyone: parents, teachers, and of course the kids. Last year, when school events started up again after all the restrictions, I began noticing a man who kept showing up. He introduced himself as an amateur photographer and offered to take pictures of the kids at events, completely free of charge. At first, no one thought much of it. He was polite, always had a friendly smile, and seemed genuinely interested in capturing happy moments. But during the spring festival at the school, something about him started to bother me. While the kids were running around, I noticed he wasn't just taking pictures of the performances or family groups. He was focusing on random moments: kids sitting alone in the corner, a mom distracted on her phone, little details like backpacks or toys left on the ground. At first, I told myself it might just be his artistic style, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched everything. It was like he was collecting more than just images. I decided to pay closer attention to him at the next few events. He was always there, like clockwork, with his camera hanging around his neck and that same casual but alert posture. I started noticing that he rarely talked to any parents or teachers, keeping a strange kind of distance, almost like he wanted to blend into the background. At one talent show, I saw him spend nearly half an hour taking photos of a little girl playing by herself near the playground, far from the stage. Something in my gut told me that wasn't normal, but I didn't have anything solid to act on. It wasn't until I talked to some of the teachers that my gut feeling turned into full-blown alarm. No one seemed to know who he was, where he came from, or why he was always there. I found out he never asked for permission to take pictures, and whenever someone asked for his name, he'd give vague answers and disappear quickly. That's when I knew I had to look into this guy. At the next event, I waited until he started packing up his gear and approached him, trying to make small talk. He was polite but dodged every direct question I asked, which only made me more suspicious. That night, I started digging for answers. My first move was to check social media. It was like the guy didn't exist. No profiles on popular platforms, no mentions in local groups, nothing. After a few frustrating days of digging, I finally found a simple website that seemed to belong to him. It had several galleries of photos from school events in our town and nearby areas. But what really made my stomach turn was a section labeled Private Collections. These photos weren't from public events. They were of kids at parks, playgrounds, and even in moments that could only have been taken from outside someone's window. That crossed every line imaginable. The next day, I brought everything I found to the police department. I laid out my concerns, showed them the website, and urged them to investigate. But in a small town, things don't always move as they should. They told me to stay calm, that maybe he was just an eccentric guy. Frustrated, I decided to handle it myself. At the next event, I waited until he was about to leave, then confronted him directly. I told him I knew about the hidden photos and demanded an explanation. He froze for a moment, then muttered something like, "You don't understand," before bolting out of there. After that confrontation, I thought he'd pack up and leave town, but I was dead wrong. A few days later, weird things started happening. First, it was the silent phone calls, just heavy breathing on the other end. Then, I started noticing small, random objects left in my yard. A child's hair tie, a button from a jacket, even an old rubber ball. I knew those things weren't mine, and the connection to his creepy photos felt too obvious to ignore. The sense of invasion made my skin crawl, and I could barely sleep at night. The breaking point came one evening when I got home to find my back door slightly open. I rushed inside, heart pounding, and went straight to my office, where I'd kept all the documents and screenshots about his activities. Everything was still there, but sitting on my desk was a photo. It was a picture of me, taken from outside my kitchen window while I was washing dishes. The shot was so clear you could see the exhaustion on my face. My blood ran cold, and that's when it hit me. He had shifted his focus to me. After that night, my life became a constant state of paranoia. Every noise, every shadow outside my window felt like him. I reinforced all the locks on my house and installed security cameras, but it didn't give me the peace I was hoping for. In fact, the cameras only made things worse. One morning, I reviewed the footage and saw a figure standing on the sidewalk in front of my house for several minutes before disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't make out his face, but deep down, I knew it was him. He was letting me know he was still around. That was the final straw. I gathered all the evidence I had, including the footage from my cameras, and pushed the police department to take action. This time, they agreed to open an official investigation. A team went to the address linked to the domain of his website, but when they got there, the house was completely empty. No furniture, no equipment, no signs that anyone had been living there recently. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Still, the website was taken down, and the case was formally recorded. But I knew this wasn't over. Even with his site gone and the police involved, I could still feel his presence. The silence wasn't comforting. It was unnerving. I decided to take some time off work and stayed with a friend in another city, thinking I could finally escape the anxiety. But a few days into my break, I got an anonymous text message. It read, "You shouldn't have stopped me." That message confirmed he knew exactly where I was, and my heart sank all over again. When I got back home, I knew I couldn't keep running from this. I prepared myself for whatever might happen next. That night, I stayed awake with the lights off, watching from the window. It didn't take long before I saw him again, standing on the street, holding something shiny in his hand, probably a camera. I called the police immediately, and this time, they arrived fast. He ran, but they caught him just a few blocks away. It turned out he had a history of stalking and obsessive behavior, and this wasn't his first time targeting someone. After his arrest, the nightmare finally started to fade. The police confirmed he had been collecting photos and videos for years, not just of kids, but of anyone he became fixated on. It was disturbing to think how long he had been operating unnoticed. He was charged and sentenced, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Still, the experience left scars. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after knowing he was behind bars. Even now, when I'm at school events or just walking around my neighborhood, I can't help but feel like someone's eyes are on me. Maybe it's just paranoia left over from everything that happened, or maybe it's a reminder to always trust that gut feeling. I'll never understand what drove him to do what he did, but one thing's for sure, I'll never let my guard down again. I usually don't bring work home with me, but that day, I was off duty and decided to stop by the mall to take care of a few errands, return a gift, and grab a new phone charger. It was a pretty normal day, the mall wasn't too crowded, and I took my time browsing a few stores. That's when I noticed the fire alarm went off. It wasn't blaring like you'd expect, just a quick alert that stopped on its own after a while. Nobody seemed concerned, and the security guards didn't react either. Maybe it was just a technical glitch or a random test. Still, something about it bugged me. My instincts kicked in. I decided to look into it. so I ended up in the mall security office. After flashing my ID and introducing myself, I asked to review the footage. It wasn't anything official, just my curiosity getting the better of me. The security guy on duty was pretty friendly and seemed relieved to have someone to talk to. When I asked to check the camera footage from around the time the alarm went off, he hesitated but eventually agreed. That's when things started to feel off. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it. As we reviewed the footage, I noticed something weird. A maintenance guy in the standard blue uniform was always near the areas where the alarms were triggered. In one clip, I could clearly see him pull the lever and casually walk away like nothing happened. But what really stood out was what happened next. A woman, always alone, would appear in the footage, looking confused, maybe trying to figure out what was going on. And every time, the same maintenance guy would approach her, gesturing like he was there to help, then leading her toward more isolated parts of the building. I pointed it out to the security guard and asked to roll the footage back a few hours earlier. The same pattern repeated. Alarms going off in different spots, women showing up, and the same guy always involved. It was too much to be a coincidence. When I asked the guard if anyone had ever noticed this before, he shook his head, looking uncomfortable. He said the alarms malfunctioned sometimes, and nobody had really paid attention to it. But I knew there was more to it. Something was seriously wrong. I decided I needed to confront the guy, but first, I wanted to dig deeper and see how far this went. I asked the security guard to show me footage from the previous weeks. That's when the full scope of the situation hit me. The same pattern showed up again and again. Alarms being set off, women drawn to the areas, and the same maintenance guy always lurking nearby. In some clips, the women disappeared from the cameras for a few minutes before reappearing, often rushing away or looking visibly upset. It was chilling. It became painfully obvious this wasn't just bad luck. When I asked the guard who this guy was, he gave me his name and mentioned that he'd been working there for months without any issues. But something didn't sit right with me. I asked him to take me to the area where the maintenance guy usually worked. It was a back room near the emergency exits. As we got closer, I could feel my heartbeat speeding up. I didn't know what I was about to walk into, but I knew I had to act fast. The door to the room was locked, but we could hear faint noises coming from inside. I knocked, identifying myself, but there was no response. That's when I decided to force the door open. The guard hesitated, but eventually helped me. When we finally got inside, the smell hit me first. A mix of chemicals and something damp and stale. The room was small, cluttered with tools, but the guy wasn't there. What immediately caught my eye was a storage cabinet in the corner. I opened it, expecting to find equipment or supplies, but instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were purses, women's clothing, and even IDs. Each one belonged to a different woman, and some of the faces on the IDs were familiar. I recognized at least two from the footage we'd watched earlier. It was clear that this guy had been keeping these items as trophies. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the realization sunk in. This was way worse than I'd thought. As I was trying to process what I just found, we suddenly heard quick footsteps in the hallway. The security guard froze, looking as spooked as I felt. We stepped out of the room immediately, scanning the area, but the hallway was empty. I knew I had to call for backup. I phoned the local precinct, quickly explaining the situation. While we waited for the officers to arrive, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The footage, the evidence in that room, and the realization of just how many victims there could have been. This wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was undeniable. It felt like forever before the police showed up. When they did, I walked them through everything, what we found, what I'd seen on the footage, and where I thought the guy might be. The head of mall security showed up as well, looking pale as a sheet as he took it all in. The police started combing through the room, and in a hidden compartment, they found an old phone. On it were videos and photos, taken by the guy himself, of the women he had lured to those isolated spots. The images were disturbing, and the officer's expressions said it all. They immediately put out an alert for the man, but he was already gone. The mall was practically shut down as the police continued their investigation. I stayed on the case because I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Some of the videos were of women who hadn't been seen at the mall since the incidents, and that fact alone made my stomach turn. The police managed to track down a few of the women, and while many of them recalled feeling uncomfortable or uneasy around the maintenance guy, they hadn't had any solid proof to report him. Others had no idea they'd even been filmed. The helplessness I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Later that night, a team found the man's uniform discarded near one of the emergency exits, but there was still no sign of him. Nobody knew where he'd gone, and the thought of him being out there somewhere made my skin crawl. As I reviewed the footage one last time before leaving the mall, I noticed something I hadn't caught before. In one of the clips, he looked directly at the camera, smirking, right before turning it off. It was like he knew we'd be watching. Even now, that image of him staring into the lens haunts me. I'll never forget that night. I was assigned to what seemed like a straightforward case. Track a guy suspected of breaking into homes and stealing while families were out. My job was simple: follow him and gather enough evidence for an arrest. The guy had a system. He'd visit houses listed for rent or sale, pretending to be an interested buyer. He'd check out every detail: entry points, blind spots, security systems. My orders were clear: observe but don't engage. But the moment I started tailing him, I felt something was off. There was something almost theatrical about how he inspected the houses. That afternoon, he visited 3 properties. At each one, he acted polite, chatted with the agents, and asked casual questions about the neighborhood. I kept my distance, taking notes, but my gut told me he was planning something much bigger than just a simple burglary. As night fell, he drove to a more isolated neighborhood. One of the houses he'd visited earlier had all its lights off, but something made me park a safe distance away and keep watch. That's when I saw it: a shadow moving quickly across a second-floor window. My heart started racing. It was him. I knew something was wrong, but going in without backup was risky. I called the station to request support, but they told me it could take up to 20 minutes for anyone to arrive. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped into the backyard, trying to be as quiet as possible. The house was eerily silent, but as I approached the back door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. Not a good sign. Inside, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. Then I heard muffled whispers and what sounded like someone quietly sobbing in the living room. Moving carefully, I crept closer, trying not to make a sound. Peeking through the door, I saw him. He had a couple and a teenage girl tied up on the floor, their mouths taped shut. He was armed and pacing the room like he was trying to figure out his next move. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a burglary anymore. This was a hostage situation. I knew I had to act, but without a clear plan, every step felt like a gamble. The only advantage I had was that he didn't know I was there. I pressed myself against the wall near the door, straining to hear anything that might clue me in on what he was planning. He was muttering to himself, saying things like, "It was too easy to fool that agent earlier." Each word added to the tension. Then, I heard footsteps. He was moving toward the door where I was standing. I froze, holding my breath, my hand gripping my gun tightly. For a second, I was sure he could hear my heartbeat. Time felt like it was crawling. I waited until he moved back to the center of the room and glanced inside again. He was still holding the gun but seemed distracted. I knew I had to come up with something better than just charging in. Looking around, I spotted a small ceramic vase on a hallway table nearby. I carefully grabbed it and threw it toward the kitchen, creating a loud crash. He spun around immediately, his attention locked on the noise. It was my opening. While he was distracted, I slipped into the living room and hid behind a cabinet nearby. The couple and the teenage girl spotted me, their eyes wide with fear. They looked like they were pleading with me not to get caught. I motioned for them to stay calm and stayed low, trying to think of a way to disarm him without putting everyone at risk. He kept pacing, muttering something about not getting caught again. It hit me that this wasn't his first time pulling something like this, and he might be willing to go all the way. I saw an opportunity when his grip on the gun loosened slightly. This was it. I stepped toward him quietly, but then the floor creaked under my foot. His head whipped around, and for a split second, our eyes locked. My heart sank as he raised the gun, but before he could pull the trigger, I lunged at him with all my strength. The gun flew out of his hand, sliding under the table, and we were locked in a chaotic struggle. The fight was messy and chaotic. He was stronger than I expected, but he seemed a little off balance, which gave me a slight edge. As we wrestled, he tried desperately to reach for the gun under the table, but I managed to knock him back before he could grab it. The noise of furniture scraping the floor and our heavy breathing filled the house. I knew I couldn't let him regain control of the situation. After a desperate push, I managed to pin him down, pressing his arm hard against the floor. That's when he started yelling, saying things like, "I won't go down alone." The words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't have time to process what he meant. I grabbed a belt hanging off a nearby chair and used it to tie his hands. With him restrained, my attention turned to the hostages. I ripped the tape from their mouths and whispered for them to stay quiet. They were terrified, especially the teenage girl, who was trembling uncontrollably. I tried to reassure them while keeping an eye on the guy to make sure he wasn't planning anything else. I wanted to get everyone out of there immediately, but I knew we had to wait for backup. The police were still a few minutes away, and any wrong move could escalate things. The family looked shaken to their core, staring at me like they couldn't believe someone was there to help. Meanwhile, the guy on the floor had gone quiet, staring down with a mix of frustration and something I couldn't quite place. Then, finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. Relief started to set in. When the officers arrived, they quickly took over the scene. The suspect was hauled to his feet, and as they were leading him out, he glanced back at me and muttered something under his breath. "This isn't over," he said, just loud enough for me to hear. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I acted like it didn't bother me. After giving my statement and ensuring the family was safe, I left. But his words stuck with me. To this day, I can still hear them. It felt less like a threat and more like a promise.